Hey guys, we are back into our Orchid Society meeting, Mid Lakes Orchid Society, and we have the honor today of having Mr. Art Chadwick, the one and only.
The one and only. That's right. Well,
Tell us more about.
Well, sure. Thank you for having me. This is a Cattleya lecture. Historical Cattleyas were my father's thing, and this is a continuation of his lineage, and it follows the book he wrote, the classic Cattleyas, which we also have for sale tonight.
This book, right?
Yes. Right. So my father wrote this. It's now in its second edition, and it's very popular. Many people consider it the best Cattleya book out there. So I'll try to live up to that billing.
Nice. Now, I was reading online, your son also works with you.
Well, somewhat. I've got two kids. One's an aerospace engineer, one's a nutritionalist. They're not all that into the orchids. They're on the board of directors, but really it's me and my staff, and I have about 20 employees.
Nice.
Yeah.
And you started it, well, your father started it.
Together we started it in 1989, but he'd been growing since the 40s as a hobby, strictly a hobby.
Okay.
So we've taken the hobby and turned it into a business.
And they're out of Richmond, Virginia.
Richmond, Virginia, yeah, with 2 stores in the city and then the greenhouses on the outskirts.
And it's okay to visit your...
Absolutely, 6 days a week, all 3 locations.
So that's on the bucket list, right? Awesome. Thank you so
All
much.
right, absolutely, my pleasure.
Thanks so much.
So we were just talking about how you name your
Hybrids.
your hybrids.
Right.
You can explain it to me again?
Right. So this hybrid's been named after Mrs. Woodrow Wilson, who was First Lady in the 1915.
Oh.
So it's part of the First Lady series, and these are clones that are about a year from blooming, and it's an amazing purple. My father actually bred it. So people love that, but they also love the old varieties that we're reissuing that haven't been seen in 20 years. The species, Trianni, the national flower of Colombia, with the purple flares, hasn't been seen since 1920. So we're reissuing it. And of course, Cattleya skinneri, the national flower of Costa Rica. And you'll hear all about it in the lecture.
Oh, yes. Super excited. Thank you.
Listen, what did I tell you at home? We're
That
not
we weren't
buying.
going to buy anything. Well, I
don't
guess you're going to have to wait and see.
This is... All right. Just when I thought we were out.
It ain't over till...
You say stop. All right.
Dad was in orchids for almost 100 years. Art's been in orchids for 50 years. So he has a lot of knowledge, a lot of information, and a lot to bring to the orchid world. If you ever get a chance, you definitely want to visit this orchid nursery up in Virginia, outside of Richmond. Art is an author. He's got a couple books. Quite knowledgeable about orchids, to say the least. So we've got a great program for you tonight that you're going to enjoy. Art Chadwick.
Thank you, Brian. My partner in crime over there. He's a landscaper. He does tropical palm trees. He plants them in people's yards. I admire him. I admired what he does. I only grow orchids. My father's been growing Cattleya orchids since the 1940s. And I'm second generation. It's Chadwick and Son Orchids. I'm the son. I have 2 children. They're not too interested in orchids right now. One's an aerospace engineer, PhD at Cornell, and one is a nutritionalist in Raleigh. But you have to be a certain age to appreciate orchids. So for me, it struck me at 25. I was an electrical engineer in corporate America, and I said, I don't know, Dad, about this corporate engineering thing. Let's do a business together. So we turned his hobby into a business in 1989. He had 40 or 50 years experience. I had none, and we worked it out. He taught me everything, and I lived and breathed orchids for the next 35 years. I live right where I work, 24 hours a day, but it's not really work. Working with plants, it's not really work. It's a passion, I love it. Sometimes I'm out late at night picking slugs off plants with a flashlight. You may know that Cattleya orchids used to be known as the corsage flower. Back in the day, What was the day? The day was the 1920s to the 1960s. It had a 40-year run. It started with the species and it went to the hybrids. And now they're potted plants in people's houses. The same plant that produced those corsage flowers are grown for fun. Will corsages come back? We're going to find out. Before tonight's over, we're going to identify the 8 Cattleya species that are on the screen. These were used for cut flowers in the earliest days of corsages. They were imported from South America and grown in greenhouses and then cut for flowers. My father describes how you were underdressed if you didn't go out with your Cattleya corsage on. Does anybody have a similar experience? Underdressed. Okay, Brian, let's begin. Cattleya is in the golden age of orchid fashion. This was my mother in 1948. Just kidding. This is a professional model showing some of the many uses of cut Cattleyas back in the heyday of corsages. She's got 4 flowers in her hair. Has anybody tried this at home before? Only in Hawaii. Okay, Brian. Before there were orchid corsages, there were these lesser flowers. Gardenias and camellias. Egads. How boring. My father always emphasized that no 2 women want to wear the same corsage, just like they don't want to wear the same dress. So Cattleyas were perfect because every flower is different. But these are all the same. Brian? So when the Cattleyas hit the market, wow, that was a game changer. People threw away all those other flowers and wore these. Every single flower is different. They've got the petals, the curls, the fragrance. It's all there, the complete package. Here's our classic Cattleya orchid corsage. Does this ring any bells? You've got the fluff, the white fluff that protects the flowers because they're so fragile. Then the matching ribbon, which are the florists tie ahead of time by the thousands. And then those stick pins. How did you all navigate the stick pins? Ouch. So here's how the florist operation worked. In the 40s, the growers would cut all the flowers and take them to the florist, and then the public would buy them, and with any luck, they could be worn Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. Maybe you put them in the refrigerator, you recut the stem, you do whatever you can to protect them. You got to watch out for that slow dances because they'll crush.
Wrist corsage.
There is the wrist corsage, yes. So World War II was a huge time for Cattleya orchids. The GIs would go away and they would leave their lady with a Cattleya orchid to remember them by. And then when they returned, they would bring their lady a Cattleya orchid on back. And these were $20 a flower back in the 40s. Fortunes were made at this time. There weren't enough to go around. They were so popular. So the big growers of the day, such as Rivermont Orchids in Tennessee, had greenhouses upon greenhouses full of Cattleya orchids, and they couldn't keep up with the demand. You might recognize Albertson Merkel. That's a Florida nursery. Did anybody go there during their heyday? Tell us about it.
I'm from Jacksonville, and Mandarin is in Jacksonville.
Uh-huh. Weren't they in Boynton Beach? Boynton Beach.
That's not Mandarin. That's in Boynton where they are.
Well, I guess they have 2 locations.
Yeah, they did.
Yep.
Or did.
Did, right, unfortunately. Okay, Brian? The big guy was Powhatan Orchids in Bergenfield, New Jersey. They supplied much of the East Coast. Here there's 200,000 seedlings that Mr. Patterson is looking over. They take 7 years to bloom from seed, so it's a little waiting time there. But boy, when they bloom, you've really got something. Key Sweater Orchid Gardens in Long Island. Imagine trying to cut these flowers for Mother's Day. Boy, the fragrance alone would knock you out. And on the West Coast, we have Rod McClellan. So every one of these greenhouses could have held a different Cattleya species. All the June bloomers, all the July bloomers, all the August bloomers. That's how they staged their plants, because the corsage market was furious. Because the commercial growers couldn't keep up with the demand, hobbyists like you sprang into action and built little lean-tos on their houses by the thousands all across America. People said, $20 a flower? I can do this. So little lean-tos, they just put them together themselves. Maybe they had 10 or 20 Cattleyas in there. They could make $1,000 every year. You could count on it. Now here's my sister. This is some of the fancy bling that was going on. You know, the fur coats and these outrageous hats. This is a triple corsage that was sure to get the attention of a man. And the brides were involved. This lady has 13 in her arrangement. These are semi-albas, white with a purple lip. Many people find that the most attractive of all colors. There's white, purple, and then white with a purple lip. Thomas Young Orchids was a huge grower, and they ran these series of hilarious cartoons in the 1940s in horticulture magazines. And they implied that if a woman had a corsage, the men were all over her. Look at all these men trying to get to that woman, all because of that corsage. Entire flower shows were devoted to just Cattleya orchids. One whole exhibit, just Cattleyas. Then the first ladies got involved. Mrs. Woodrow Wilson was the first. His first wife died while he was in office, and he wasted no time in getting a second wife. Just snapped his fingers, and boom, Edith appears, and he takes her out on the town. She's sporting 4 flowers on her lapel at the World Series. Here's Lou Hoover, also at the World Series. I love this photograph. Every woman is wearing a corsage. Just a grand affair. Eleanor Roosevelt, here she is in Richmond. My nursery is just south of Washington, 2 hours, and a lot of politicians come down there. It's just a train ride away. So here she came down, and her 2 friends are looking at her longingly, wishing that they had a Cattleya corsage. And later in life, she continued to wear Cattleyas, but Frank is not too interested. Then Bess Truman came along, and the whistle-stop tours she and her husband were known for. And the crowds would gather along the railroad tracks as they came by, and they were all cheering because of those Cattleyas. Look how big they are. Now for extra credit, who is the actress that Mrs. Truman is standing next to?
Madonna.
Surely somebody recognizes this person.
Yeah. Greta.
Greta Garbo?
Greta Garbo? No.
Your mother.
That's a good one. Actually, I've forgotten. Now here's a lovely photograph of 3 first ladies all wearing Cattleyas. Mrs. Truman, Mrs. Roosevelt, and Mrs. Wilson. My father always talked about Mamie Eisenhower as really putting Cattleyas on the map. Everywhere she went, she wore these Cattleya corsages. Here she is on Inauguration Day, pinning on her own corsage. And here she is in Richmond, right down from Washington. Her husband's there, everybody's going wild. Look at that triple corsage they're saying. A very familiar sight. Wherever she went, it just had a touch of glamour to the whole thing. Here she seems to be playing dress up with her friends. They're just absolutely loaded down with Cattleyas, all down their sashes. I don't know what they were talking about, but it looks very exciting. Now later in life, Mrs. Eisenhower continued to wear Cattleyas, although sometimes they were upside down. That is a fashion faux pas. You always wear them with the lip down the way they grow in the wild. Who was her handler that day? Jacqueline Kennedy was only 31 when she became First Lady. Here she is on her wedding day with a whole bouquet of white Cattleyas. And her family is just riveted by these Cattleyas. Now I love this photograph because she's the only one not wearing a Cattleya corsage. And the reason for that is she was 31 and she didn't want to wear what the older ladies were wearing. So everyone but her has one. That could be the end of the story, but it's not. Because she introduced what's called the pocketbook corsage, where you take that corsage, pin it on your purse, walk right in. You've got the glamour of the flower, then you put it down and chat a little bit, pick it back up. You're not tied down. So once people saw the pocketbook corsage, it became a thing. Everybody had to do it. Now for extra credit, who is the lady that Lady Bird Johnson is talking to? Oh, this is Muriel Humphreys, the Vice President's wife. Come on, y'all. Now this is an amazing photograph. Here her assistant is pinning on her corsage, and she has a spare corsage on a silver platter in case the first one doesn't go quite right. That's how important the corsages were in the day. So all these large flowered Cattleya species grow wild in South America and a little bit in Costa Rica. Has anyone been to these tropical countries to see them bloom? Where did you go?
Costa Rica and Colombia.
Costa Rica and Colombia. Anybody else? Colombia?
Panama.
Ecuador, Panama. We're going to introduce the concept of the Cattleya wheel. This lets growers know when their Cattleyas will bloom, because when they're out of bloom, all the leaves look the same. You would have no idea when they bloom. So growers had one of these sheets in their greenhouse to let them know. Cattleya labiata blooms in the fall. Cattleya triani blooms in the winter, and Cattleya mossy blooms in the spring. If you had those three species, you have something in bloom most of the year. You don't have to force them, you don't put ice cubes on them, or any trickery. They just bloom all by themselves around the clock. So let's look at the first one. This is the fall blooming Cattleya labiata. This is a nice photograph because it shows the foliage in addition, so it shows the scale. This is a pretty good sized plant, 6 or 8 large flowers. They last a month. What's there not to love? The term typical refers to what you would typically find in the jungle, which is a lavender. So here's 4 different typical labiatas. They look very similar, and then each one lovely. People were first exposed to what Cattleya labiata looked like from a series of paintings that Martin Johnson Head painted in the 1860s. They're found in art museums all over the country today. He traveled to Brazil and painted these amazing paintings. And he's got hummingbirds and other little things in there. Artistic liberty. But the paintings survive, And this was the Americans' first exposure to the species. Now all these large flowered Cattleyas come in 3 colors: purple, white, and white with the purple lip. This is the pure white one. Isn't it just angelic? And the semi-alba, white with the purple throat. Now this particular plant has a story. First of all, it's from 1895. It has a first-class certificate from the Royal Horticultural Society. This was one of the plants in my father's collection. The way he got started in orchids, he walked home from Philadelphia as a child, passed to school, and there was an old estate back in the days of estates, and they had a grower with a greenhouse, and he would grow the plants, and when they bloomed, he'd put them in the mansion and then take them back. But as they got too big, he couldn't keep them all, so he'd throw all the extras in a pile, essentially composting them. And my father would pick up one every day on his way home from school. "Look, Mom, look what I found." Well, before long, his parents had to build him a greenhouse to hold his Cattleyas. This was one of the plants that he acquired very early on in the 40s, which came from somebody maybe from the 20s, and then all the way back from the 1800s. He still had that plant in his collection when he passed away a couple years ago. He had 800 plants, and they all had stories like this. It was overwhelming when you went into the greenhouse because he would start talking about a story, one plant, and there were 800 of them. You were saturated quickly. But I had an extra piece of this plant, a 120-year-old plant, and I put it on eBay last summer just to see what would happen. Starting bid, 200. Maybe no one will buy it, or maybe it'll be popular, who knows. Guess how much it sold for?
$4,000.
$3,800. It's hard to put a price on a 120-year-old plant. Not only do the Cattleyas live forever, but they increase in value over time. And our classic semi-alba, here's a specimen plant. A specimen is sort of like that Vanda there. They get huge if you let them. So here's 5 or 6 sprays on one big plant. You really can't improve on that in any amount of hybridizing. It's perfect just the way it is. And this is what's called a blush, white overlaid with a little bit of lavender. Just the loveliest thing. Now we're on to Cattleya triani, the national flower of Colombia. They just grow wild in the trees. This is our classic triani. Very wide petals, narrow throat, and it lasts for 6 weeks. That's what we want, long-lasting flowers. Because we're up against Phalaenopsis, which essentially are plastic. So here's 4 triani typicals. They're lavender, round, and they last for 6 weeks. Everyone's favorite.
Except for Phalaenopsis.
Except for Phalaenopsis. This is one of our stud plants. Everyone likes the stud plants. These are pieces of each other. This one plant, it hasn't been cloned yet, so we cut it into pieces, and now we have 5 or 6. And they make such a show when they're grouped together. Here's a lovely semi-alba, white with a purple lip. This is from the 20s. Here's a slide my father took in the 40s before cloning was involved. So if you couldn't clone a plant, but you wanted more of it, you would split it in half. Then a couple years later, you'd split those in half. And 4, 6, 8, 16. Before you know, you could have an entire greenhouse of the same variety. And that's what this grower did. And the pure albas from 1919, just as pure and elegant as could be. And in the spring, we have Cattleya mossy. This is the national flower of Venezuela. This color was known as orchid color, even though we know orchids come in all colors. But customers would ask for this color by name because it was this beautiful shade of lavender magenta. And that lip was a marbled throat. That's indicative of mossy. And the petals sort of fall forward a little bit. They don't go out flat. Some of modern breeding, they're trying to make them all round and flat, but we don't want our Cattleya species to lose their endearing qualities. That's what makes a species a species. So mossies 4 forward. Here's 4 typical mossies with their falling forward nature. This was my father's greenhouse in the springtime. He loved to make sibling crosses of the old varieties. Many were 100 years old. Some may even have viruses, but he would dry pod the seeds. And when you dry pod the seeds, you pollinate it, the seeds form, and you let the pod crack open all by itself, and the seeds pour out, and they're virus-free. But you have to wait a year for that pod to crack open by itself. Many people today cut them green, and it's faster, but you run the risk of spreading virus to the children. So we always used dry potting for his seedlings. Now since, yes ma'am?
How did he learn that?
Oh, you know, these Cattleya people, they talk. But since his day, a new technology has come around which lets you remove the virus from mature plants. The University of Florida researcher discovered this technique. So a virus Cattleya that he would have kept for historical purposes, but he'd keep it separated so it didn't spread. You can now take that plant and send it to this lady in Florida, and she sends you back virus-free clones in a jar. They're little babies. There's maybe 20 to a jar, and they all grow up to be just like the original, but without the virus. So we have some of those clones on the table. They're about a year from blooming, but it's the most exciting thing that's happened to orchids in 100 years. Look at the fall forward petals on this FCC first class certificate in 1941. And here's one from the 80s from the Patterson collection. Isn't that just stunning? Now, this is the finest breeder of semi-albas. It's from Thomas Young Orchids, but it has this prefix, Renikiana. What is that? Well, this is sort of Cattleya slang that goes back to the 1800s in England when Mr. Renicky was the first one who found one in the wild, the first semi-alba, so he named it after himself, Mossy Renikiana. And that could have been the end of the story, but then another one was found, and then another one was found. And rather than drop the prefix, they just keep adding new variety names. So Renikiana Youngs, Renikiana this, Renikiana that. It's Cattleya slang for the advanced student. And the same goes for the pure white mossies. Mr. Wagner was the first one who found one in the wild, so he named it Cattleya wagneri. And then another one was found, and another one was found. And so here's Wagneri Kensington from Kensington Orchids. More Cattleya slang. So here's the fate of the Cattleya species back in the 1800s. An explorer would go out to the jungle and he'd bring some donkeys and they'd get some local people, natives, and they would pull the orchids off the trees, wrap them in burlap, and send them back to the States. Cross their fingers. Many of the ships sank. They never got there. Many of the boxes they'd open up and they had all rotted, all dead. But maybe 20% made the trip. So then they were planted in greenhouses and bloomed for cut flowers, and that's where it all started. So our Cattleya wheel gets very interesting when we fill in the blanks. So we're adding Schroederi between February and March, Gaskeliana in June, Worsavixii in July, Dowiana in August, and Percivalliana. It fills out the whole wheel. Now you have something every single day of the year in your collection. So when you start a Cattleya collection, you don't want them all to bloom at once. You want them to space themselves out. Well, this allows you to do this. It was first made for the cut flower growers. Cattleya schroederi is the cutest thing. It's also from Colombia, long-lasting, 6 weeks. It has this wonderful orange disc in the throat. and these curly sepals. The judges don't like the curly sepals because they have character. They want it round and flat, but that's not how they grow. So here's our Cattleya schroederi in its purest form. And then in the June, Gaskeliana. This was known as the June wedding flower. If you were a bride, this was the only flower you had if you wanted to wear orchids. They would probably wear white, but not necessarily. Here's 4 Gaskeliana typicals, the June wedding flower. And then in July, we have VICKY'S. Where did they come up with these names? VICKY'S, how would you even spell that? Well, Mr. Worsovic's found it, but for at least a century, it was known as Cattleya gigas because the flowers were so gigantic. And many of my father's labels say gigas on them. And if you didn't know that's what it was called, you'd say, what in the world? But many of them were 10 inches across. Gigas. So here he is in his greenhouse with his favorite species, VICKY'S, blooms in the dead of summer. The flowers are huge, and look at the joy it brings him. He liked it so much, he put it on the cover of his book. What greater compliment than to put an orchid on the very cover? It's now in its 2nd edition. Martha Stewart had us on her show, and she was reviewing his book. And my job was to unveil an orchid that we had named after her on national TV. 30 seconds of fame. And she had just gotten out of jail. So she had her little ankle bracelet on that tracked her every move. But she was delightful. And we spent the whole day in New York City and, all that would entail. And then in August, we have Cattleya dowiana. For many people, this is their absolute favorite orchid, but they have a love-hate relationship with it. It's the most beautiful of all, the yellow with the incredible veining and the fragrance. You would smell it before you saw it. It's the sweetest thing. However, it dies very easily if you don't know the trick. And so when these were first imported with all the other Cattleyas, growers would plant them by the thousands, and they would die by the thousands. I said, what in the world, Joe? We really need to change something here. Well, they've discovered that they like warm night temperatures, 65 degrees or more, or they rot. Whereas the other orchids like maybe high 50s. Just that little bit of temperature difference is the difference in survival for Cattleya dowiana. Here's 4 typical dowianas. Just a striking flower, there's nothing like it. So I was fortunate to see Cattleya dowiana in Costa Rica. I was not abducted. That was a plus. So this gentleman took me to this forest where, through a translator, he showed me this dowiana. And you just can't believe seeing it on a tree. How can this really be? You've grown it in a pot for all these years, and there it is. Now, it's not this shiny, happy plant that you might see on your show table, where people have polished the leaves and kept it under controlled environments. Monkeys have walked all over it, slugs have chewed it, birds have pecked at it, botrytis rampant, sunburn, and yet it comes back year after year forever. Now, Costa Rica, like many of these tropical countries, has a problem with the tourists stealing the orchids. Well, I'll just put that little one in my sock, it'll be fine. Well, if everyone did that, there would be none left in the jungles. So they're trying to preempt this problem by making little baby orchids that they sell in the airports next to the M&Ms. So let's see, I'll take a bag of peanut M&Ms, 2 dowianas, and I'll get on the plane. They're maybe $1 or $2 each. What a deal. Now, they don't tell you it'll take at least 7 years to get it to bloom, but it takes great pressure off the forest, and I think it's a good thing overall. And the last of the 8 species that round out our cut flower Cattleya wheel is Percivalliana. Now this is not a sweet smelling species. How would you describe this species smell? Stinks. Roadkill? That's pretty harsh.
You wear it as a corsage.
Well, that's the thing. Would this really be a good corsage if it doesn't smell good? So that was a small strike. And also you need 2 or 3 to make a corsage because the flowers are smaller. But it is a cute little thing, and it's the only species that blooms right in December. So this is all you had. So here's the fate of the Cattleya species. Everybody was growing them, they were wildly popular, and then the hybrids came along. And the grower said, oh really, I can get that out of my greenhouse? Well, I'll just throw away all these species and bring in the hybrids. And that's what they did by the thousands all across the country. Just think what those species would be worth today. And then the cymbidiums came along. My father describes that as the absolute end of corsages because they no longer had the glamour of a Cattleya. They were sold for $2.99 in plastic boxes at the checkout counter. Where's the glamour in that? And for the grower, he could get 10 or 20 or 30 blooms on a plant very easily, and the greenhouses were much cooler. You didn't have to heat them at all. 45 degrees and they would really produce. So they were cheap to make, cheap to grow, everything about it cheap. And that was the end of the Cattleyas. So the question always comes up, could Cattleyas return as corsages? We see bell bottoms again. Who would ever wear bell bottoms? How about records? That would be the last thing you would want to buy. They scratch, they're hopeless. And yet they're now outselling CDs and other forms of music. Things are cyclical, so it could happen. So I got some of my friends together and we went to an antique store and got some period clothing. And we played dress up. So we made some old-time corsages with some old-time outfits like they would have done in the 40s. This is the deluxe corsage. Now the ponytail tuck, this is something that you could do yourself at home. Just stick a few flowers in there and you're good for the evening. Now the flower fan, that's a variation of the pocketbook corsage because you can pick it up, you walk around, you put it down, chat again, pick it up. This was widely done in the 40s. And of course the very hard one, the hair swirl. 4 flowers in your hair. If you turn your head too quickly, boom. But why stop there? Why don't we go with the halo twirl and put 5 in? Or maybe right on top. This was one of my Phalaenopsis growers. She's got the summer whirl. We had a few cocktails and we were having a good time. Now the bridesmaids get involved because they're also an opportunity to show off their flowers. The grand corsage. Now this is Cattleya maximum, which was never a cut flower because the petals are very narrow. But if you put 10 or 20 of them together, yes, you can do a corsage. And the grand finale, the luxury corsage. You've got out your grandmother's fur coat and you're totally blinged out. And the modern day first ladies are very much on board with this. Here's Laura Bush. She's active in the Dallas Garden Club. She grows her own Laura Bush orchids. So when I speak down there, she's there in the front row. No pressure at all. We've got Secret Service everywhere, but she's into Cattleyas. And Michelle Obama is also into Cattleyas. Here we presented her with a certificate, and we did the Obama bump. It was classic. Mrs. Trump wrote me this lovely letter. There's her flower. It's an improvement on our nation. I couldn't agree more. And our current First Lady, Jill Biden. So here we are, we had 2 seedlings in bloom at the same time. One had a purple lip and one had a yellow lip. So we had something to talk about, the variation in seedlings. Oh, she said, great, I'll take the purple one and I'll put the yellow one on Joe's desk. So for that one moment in time, we had an orchid on both the president's desk and the first lady's desk. Just another day. So we have a new book coming out in about 4 weeks on the 19 first ladies who have had orchids named after them, and the stories and all that. So thank you very much. Are there any questions about Cattleyas? Yes, sir.
What did your dad come up with that orchid tie?
Yes, well, those are hand-painted silk orchid ties. He had them locked up in his cabinet. I wear them now to special occasions. The way Cattleyas are grown in Virginia, where our nursery is, we use sphagnum moss in little clay pots. They like to be pot-bound, and they just, once they outgrow that little pot, we put them in one pot size bigger. We don't want to put them in a big pot or they never really get rooted. But you can also use bark chips with plastic. The plastic sort of holds them on, or the bark drains quickly. Those are sort of the two options we use, clay and moss or bark with plastic. But down here, gosh, you just tie them to trees and you're done. I'm very envious of all that. Yes?
My dad and I visited you late 50s. You were so very, very nice to us, and we've never forgotten it. He started growing orchids in 1949 when he was out, just came out of the Army.
Really?
Yes, so.
That's a great story. Wow.
Yeah. So he's been to Patterson, he's been to your place.
Oh my.
My aunt, my great aunt, had a florist shop in Philadelphia, and she specialized in orchid corsages. So she started that in the late 30s. My mother worked for her, so my mother did. I grew up in Miami. She did everybody's wedding.
Wow.
So
Are there any pictures of all this?
I have a gazillion pictures.
We need to talk. Any other questions about Cattleyas? Who wants to come to our nursery in Richmond and see these 12 orchid greenhouses?
It's been a while since I've been.
Our main business is taking care of other people's orchids. Have you heard of this thing?
Boarding.
It's the craziest thing. It's called orchid boarding. And for $2 a month, we'll bring anybody's orchid back into bloom for them. Up in Virginia, you can't just tie them to trees. People need a little bit of TLC. Even though they're grocery store orchids, a lot of them, Phalaenopsis, which are plastic, for $2 a month. And we have 13,000 plants we're babysitting for people. We've never advertised that we offer the service. It's always been word of mouth. Did you hear Chadwick's will bring your orchid back into bloom? What? Here you go. Take them away. Here we are, 35 years later. All right, yes, one more.
And florists up in Michigan would do the same thing in nursery.
Orchid boarding.
You know, when people would go, any kind of flower in their nurseries for the winter when people went away.
Very nice. You guys have been wonderful. Thank you.
Well, here we have it.
This is the end of the video and the beginning of another 3 acquisitions.
Yes, which I think in another video we should talk about them. Especially there's one that's kind of like, it just like screams at me, the information that was given to us about this one, which I think it's this one in particular.
It was a beautiful night.
It really was. It was a lot of fun.
Yeah.
It was so much fun.
Art Chadwick is a big name in the orchid world, as you heard.
Yes.
And we are so happy that he was here at our Orchid Society.
Yes.
Mid Lakes Orchid Society, if you're in this area, Mount Dora, Leesburg, Ocala, Claremont, this is a great society.
Yes.
Okay? And we want to grow it. And yep, so you're saying we'll talk about these plans in another video.
I think we'll talk about them in another video. So you have to stay tuned and This one's going to be very interesting to know about this one.
All right.
I mean,
So-
the other two as well, but this one, it really sparked a little interest.
Great.
Yeah,
So with that, we thank you all.
yes.
And
If you haven't done so, please subscribe. If you have, thank you so much. Leave a comment, a like, and remember to click that little bell. It'll always remind you every time that we put another video out. And we'll see you next time.
we'll see you next time.
Bye.